cardiovascular diseases. So we're going to understand a lot of different things here. There's only three things, well, we'll just go into it. There's only three things that can be wrong with your heart. That's one of the basic ideas. The first one, if your heart doesn't pump enough, right? Meaning the force of contraction is less than it should be. Usually happens when you get old. Usually happens when when your muscles aren't as strong and these systems fail over time. And this is called heart failure. So literally the heart cannot pump enough blood to the tissues. The second one, and we'll go through each one of these and talk about different drugs and different symptoms, and then drugs to treat those symptoms and to actually treat the diseases themselves. The second one is an abnormal heart rate called an arrhythmia. Arrhythmias are very difficult to treat because what determines your heartbeats? It's all ionic channels, all voltages, right? It's all electrical potentials. These electrical potentials are controlled by ion channels. So the only effective way to change to fix an arrhythmia by drugs is to treat with an inhibitor or an activator of certain sodium or potassium channels. This could be difficult because a lot of sodium and potassium channels in the body, ones in the heart versus ones in the lungs versus ones in your muscles, are similar. So it could lead to tremors or different types of side effects that are not very favorable. So for older patients that have arrhythmias or had some kind of heart complication that caused an arrhythmia, the go-to is to get a pacemaker. Because the pacemakers are, they're invasive, but they, especially for people who are towards end of life, they will keep a normal heartbeat without damaging drugs that can cause severe side effects. So the next thing that can happen, so it's two things. You have failure to pump hard enough. You have an abnormal pumping, an abnormal rhythm, arrhythmia, and then you have coronary artery disease. This has a lot of names. There's coronary artery disease, CAD, not like the engineering software, not that CAD. Then you have atherosclerosis. Then there's arteriosclerosis, which is very similar, which I'll cover in a bullet point. Then you have ischemic heart disease. Three terms, all very similar. All they refer to is an obstruction in the blood vessels or in the arteries that lead to not enough oxygen getting to different parts of the atrium or ventricle, leading to no contraction and heart attack. So and a myocardial infarction. That's what it leads to. So if generally coronary artery disease is usually, it says left of right, either left or right. It's usually right coronary artery blocked by a clot or plaques. So who knows what these clots or plaques are made of usually? Fat deposits, cholesterol. Exactly. Good. So lipids, lipid deposits. So you see, when I was little, I used to see these commercials where they show an artery and they show the clots, and then they show the clots stopping and getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, and it eventually leads to a heart attack. What they say is have exercise, have a diet that's low cholesterol, always get your cholesterol monitored by a doctor every when you go for your physicals, because cholesterol, more importantly, your LDLs are very important to keep low, because those are the dangerous cholesterol molecules that can build up in your arteries and cause your ischemic heart disease or your coronary artery disease. So there's two terms. There's atherosclerosis. You're not going to have to distinguish between the two on an exam, but they're important to mention because you may see both but think they're the same word. There's atherosclerosis and arteriosclerosis. Very similar. So atherosclerosis refers to specifically plaques and cholesterol buildup in your arteries, whereas arteriosclerosis, meaning any hardening of the artery wall. It could be due to some kind of constriction, a muscular constriction of the artery that's not due to a blood clot. that is also arteriosclerosis, but not atherosclerosis. So those are two terms. Most likely they're the same thing if you're talking about a patient that has a heart attack. Most heart attacks are caused by these kind of buildups and a coronary block, but they're a little bit different. And then the disease ischemic heart disease, IHD. It's another term that's involved in this in the blocking of arteries, and it really relates to any heart problem caused by narrowing of the arteries, and it causes a lot of pain, and you might feel chest pain, and then you might be prone to heart attack. All right, any questions on that?
Professor.
Right, you can bypass the clog, and then you can be able to regenerate the heart. So you have bypass surgery, double bypass, triple bypass, quadruple bypass, which, I mean, the more bypasses you have, the longer the recovery time and the more difficult it is. So the heart it's dangerous to mess with. A stent, yeah. So a stent could overcome the blockage as well. So yeah. What factors? If you're most likely failure to pump. So if your contractions aren't there, and let's say your heart muscle is deteriorating, for example, or there's multiple clots that multiple stents or surgeries can't fix, then you could be or if your heart is deformed or genetically mutated, yes. Atrium and ventricle. Yes, yes. So backflow, that also counts as failure to pump. Yeah. Okay. So yeah, we're talking about that now. So heart failure. So progressive disorder, which is the heart's unable to pump sufficient blood to meet the tissue needs. So the main symptoms, you have fatigue, you have difficulty breathing, fluid retention, so edema. So if you have seen, usually there's people that are overweight, that are usually older or overweight, that have a swollen hands or feet. This is called edema, and this usually means there's something wrong with the way their heart's pumping. And that it means that there's a lot of fluid retention, and then retention is going to their limbs. And I'll talk about why that is in a minute. So there's also the renin-angiotensin system, and we'll talk about that more later. Yeah, but you can die from this. It's bad. Okay, so here's there's an entire reflex that has to do with heart failure that causes these severe symptoms like difficulty breathing or a lot of pain, and then swelling of the hands and feet and fluid retention. So the main problem is at the top, where it says the heart cannot pump enough blood. So that's our issue. So what's going to happen to our body? Our blood pressure is going to be low. Our receptors are going to realize, in our blood vessels, are going to realize that, one, our oxygen is low in our tissues and our blood pressure is low. So what's going to happen? I mean, the cause of, what happens is there's a decrease. Oh, someone said I can't see my slides. Whoops. Stop sharing, and then I'm going to share again. Okay, hopefully now you can see it.
Thank you, Professor.
Okay, no problem. Sorry, I didn't see the chat message until now. Okay, so if the heart cannot pump enough, then you're going to have a decreased blood supply to the tissue. Then you're going to have an activation of a reflex mechanism to increase the blood pressure. So the body will artificially increase the blood pressure by two ways. If your blood vessels are dilated, meaning the blood pressure is going to be relatively low, and then you realize the receptors are realizing that the pressure is too low, they're going to go through their transduction pathway and cause a constriction of the blood vessels. Constricting the blood vessels will cause the blood pressure to increase, kind of like a sympathetic response. So blood pressure will increase. Also, there'll be salt and water retention. This is to create more fluid in the blood vessels to also artificially increase that blood pressure. So that this is kind of the receptor's negative feedback loop for having low blood pressure. But the problem is that the heart is simply not pumping enough. So this reflex cycle will increase and increase. So you're going to have an increased preload and afterload. So what the preload and afterload is so preload, when you have the left ventricle, which goes into the atrium, the left ventricle will load up with blood and then have its force of contraction. So this would be larger because you're having more blood, but most of that blood is retained water and retained ions and salt, and it will just create an increased load. Then the afterload is the pressure of the ventricle must work against to open the valves in order to get to the atrium and then out to the arteries. So this will continue. This is a cascade that will continue because you realize that, or the heart will realize that it's pumping harder. It's not. Can you close the door? Having more fun than us. Cool, thanks. Oh, yeah. Cool, thanks. Yeah, so this cascade will keep continuing because not enough oxygen will get to the tissues, even with the increased amount of increased blood pressure, because it's artificial increase because of the fluid retention. And then this will happen, continue, and then until you die. So this is why you need to seek medical attention immediately if you have heart failure. So how do we treat it? Now, these treatments, you're going to notice, are treating the symptoms. They're not treating the problem. The problem is that your heart is not contracting hard enough. But what we can do is we can give sympathomimetics to increase the blood flow. We can use an IV to increase the blood pressure artificially by IV, but it will stop edema and all the fluid retention. We can use diuretics, we can use vasodilators to undo the contraction caused by the reflex, but those are all options. Okay. So right. So these reflexes are more of a sympathetic reflexes. So the renin-angiotensin system is a system that is dedicated to causing an increase in blood pressure. It's more of a sympathetic system, and it leads to vasoconstriction, increase in preload, and your increase in aldosterone. So which then causes your salt and water retention and your edema. And this is controlled by angiotensin. So angiotensin is, have you ever heard of ACE inhibitors, right? So this is where angiotensin comes in. So ACE inhibitors we're going to learn about are a great treatment for a lot of for high blood pressure, for hypertension. And so ACE inhibitor, so ACE stands for angiotensin converting enzyme. Now, what it does is it converts angiotensin 1 to angiotensin 2. So here it says the renin-angiotensin system leads to the release of angiotensin 2 by the conversion by ACE, which causes the vasoconstriction and causes the fluid retention. So if you can inhibit the renin-angiotensin system by an ACE inhibitor, it will then block these symptoms from occurring. But still, the problem persists of having heart failure. These are treatments of heart failure that will mitigate the symptoms, but not cure the heart failure. So here's a bunch of those. So you can use beta blockers, you can use vasodilators, you can use diuretics, you can use ACE inhibitors. A lot of these drugs we've heard of that lower the blood pressure and that maybe decrease the amount of fluid retention, but they don't solve the problem. So at the bottom, we kind of talked about the top already, but just go ahead and give something that increases the force of contraction, right? That's the best way to do it. And there is a drug called Digoxin. People call it it's Digoxin from many of the pronunciations I've seen. So Digoxin is a drug that directly increases the force of contraction by modulating or inhibiting the potassium and sodium channels, the ATPase channels, which then allow more sodium to increase inside the cell, which then leads to a larger potential, leading to a larger force of contraction. So the problem with this is that it has a lot of side effects, because you can imagine, like I said before, with ion channels, many of these ion channels are either GPCRs, and they're very similar in the body. And the muscles, and every type of muscle, cardiac muscle, even though it's different than smooth muscle and skeletal muscle, they still have the receptors have a high homology. So the problem with this is that you have a narrow margin of safety, and then you have cardiac side effects. You have also other central nervous system toxicities. It can cross the blood-brain barrier, and it's never the first line of treatment. So it's always, let's say if the person's in the hospital and none of the other treatments work to mitigate the symptoms, you might have a low dose of digoxin. So it's a last resort kind of drug. So research project, if you ever make a pharma or you're in a startup company and you're looking for a good project, a substitute for digoxin that increases the force of contraction without causing major side effects. So maybe you want to approach the receptors from different ways. You might want to find the few amino acids that are different between these cardiac receptors, these cardiac GPCRs that influx calcium and potassium or ion channels, compared to the ones in the skeletal muscle or in CNS, or making a drug that does not cross the CNS, does not cross the blood-brain barrier, meaning it's less lipophilic, so or more hydrophilic. So that's an idea, but I don't know. My company's not doing that, but it's a good idea. Okay, so any questions on that? Okay, next, ACE inhibitors. So ACE inhibitors there stops the conversion of angiotensin 1 to angiotensin 2. This leads to a dilating the blood vessels. So it stops the constriction of the blood vessels and it lowers the blood pressure. So it inhibits the enzyme that raises the blood pressure. That's basically it. That's basically all we need to know about that. And here's the system. It's not important to memorize the system. I may give you a simpler version of this diagram on an exam and ask you, all right, which enzymes would, other than the ACE receptor, can you treat in order to treat heart failure? And maybe you can treat well, there's ACE2 inhibitors already, but let's say CTSG or CMA1, right? Those proteins, for example, I'm not 100% familiar with these schematic, with this sigma transduction, because a lot of adapter proteins involved. But maybe even a transcription factor in the nucleus or something that can be inhibited, right? But I'll give you a cleaner version of this that has less stuff. But yeah. Okay, so any questions on that and on heart failure? So I know it's a very basic overview, but I mean, we could be here all day if we went in more detail, but we want to cover a little bit of everything. Okay, the next one, coronary artery disease. So when you have the circulation in your heart is impaired, meaning you have a blood clot. So you have the muscle suffers from ischemia, and which is just generally, I mean, there's a lot of pain associated with that. And then the circulation is slowed down and eventually it could stop, which can cause a heart attack. But then, so that's really what happens. Then the myocardial muscle death. So that's a myocardial infarction. That's the next step. After you get heart failure, if it's untreated, there's this myocardial infarction that can happen, which means that oxygen has been cut off from that part of the atrium so much that the muscle begins to deteriorate and die. That's really bad. So, but there's ways to, that's why early detection is important. Same with cancer, same with everything. So what we can do to treat this is we can use a coronary catheter or a bypass surgery or a stent. Or we can do, there's different revascularization techniques and also different bypass surgeries. And different like open heart surgeries of different types, and also there are several drugs that work to mitigate the amount of cholesterol buildup, and that's more preventative rather than treating coronary artery disease. So when it happens and you have it already, you have to go to the hospital. There's no drug that could just, all right, it just cleared everything out. No, because most likely you have surgery or you have some kind of IV treatment or something, or a stent put in. But the drugs are more preventative. So here's a few of the drugs that are good for treating coronary artery disease, but the first two aren't great. When you get into statins and drugs that directly correlate to the decrease in bad cholesterol or increase in good cholesterol too, HDLs, then you directly affect the coronary artery disease better. So you can use different kind of channel blockers, calcium channel blockers, beta blockers, venodilators, but those are good. I mean, what they do is you decrease, for beta blockers, I mean, you're decreasing the heart rate and decreasing the contraction, and then it lowers the body's, it's kind of a parasympathetic effect, meaning your body's going to require less oxygen. So it's kind of a way to use the word bypass, because the first word that came to mind, but bypass the real problem. But then you have, most importantly, we'll skip to anti-atherosclerotic drugs. So statins, PCSK9 inhibitors are the main two that we're going to talk about today. So statins, and also there's a few others, but statins, what they do is they inhibit the enzyme called HMG-CoA reductase, which this enzyme is responsible for synthesizing LDLs. It's a very simple approach. If you have, they figured out what enzyme increases your LDL. LDLs are bad, HDLs are good. And you inhibit it successfully. Then you stop LDL production. Great. That's what a statin does. So it blocks the enzyme, therefore slowing down the cholesterol production process, usage to treat heart disease. It's more preventative. If you already have that cholesterol buildup, very difficult to, it's not really going to do much if you have someone who's already hospitalized. But let's say you go for a heart exam or you go to a cardiologist when you're 50 and you're like, oh, look, you're building some plaques in your heart, in your artery walls. So you may want to go on a statin or some kind of blood thinner or a statin or something just to be preventative. And then the best way to be preventative is exercise, good diet, low alcohol, low fats, and things like that. All right, any questions on that? Yes. So good cholesterol actually increases the bad cholesterol. So the mechanism is not 100% known, but do I have a slide on it? Oh, here we go. Okay, I'll cover that in a second, but good question. All right, so the next thing is you have nitrate. So I'm sure on every drug commercial, they say, don't take this drug if you're taking nitrates for chest pain, right? So nitrates are a thing you take for chest pain. So angina is the word for chest pain. So nitrates like nitroglycerin, nitroglycerin is the main one, and then there's isosorbide mononitrate, and then the dinitrate version of that. That what they do is, so when you have a nitrate, it will activate guanylyl cyclase. That word might be familiar to you. We've heard of the enzyme called adenylyl cyclase, which creates cyclic AMP. You have guanylyl cyclase, which, look what it does. It converts GTP, very similar to a GPCR. So, I mean, they have both. They have the ATP version and the GTP version. So what it does is it increases your smooth muscle dilation, which then leads to vasodilation. So, meaning it relieves your coronary blockage. So it's a pretty good class of drugs, but they do have some side effects, which you have hypotension and you have reflex tachycardia, which means you can have in response a reflex tachycardia. It's a negative feedback response. So who knows what tachycardia is? Your hand up first. Yes. So basically, high blood pressure, high pulse, your heart's working too hard. And then brachycardia is the opposite, where your heart rate's too low. Yes. Yes, exactly. Good. Yeah. Yeah. Right. Right. So that's like with the caffeine and a lot of these energy drinks, that's a big problem, is that you can get a tachycardia from it. So it's blockage. So that's more, so a blockage is more brachycardia. Yeah. But tachycardia is not good either, because you can get arrhythmias from it and then you die from a heart attack. Well, hold on, let me think. So overall, yes. So a blockage will, as a reflex response, it will cause reflex tachycardia, meaning, oh, the heart's not getting enough oxygen. Let's beat faster. So let's increase the pulse. And then that will lead to a heart attack, because that part of the heart is not getting sufficient blood flow. So yeah. Okay, good. So the reflex tachycardia means that it's in response to your heart rate getting too low from nitrates or whatever the drug is. And then in response to it, you'll have a reflex which will increase the heart rate even to dangerous levels. So you can get tachycardia from that. Cool. So there's a YouTube video there on it, but we'll watch another YouTube video on, I believe, statins. Okay. So there are also anti-atherosclerotic drugs, which we kind of mentioned. But what is atherosclerosis? It's a metabolic disease that causes damages to the blood wall that results in thickening, hardening, and narrowing of the blood vessel, mainly the artery. So we're having not only an effect of clotting, but we're having a problem with the wall, with the artery wall. So a thickening or a hardening resulting from the plaques, but also a narrowing, constriction. So it's just an overall problem with blood flow in the heart. So it can cause angina, which is heart pain or chest pain, coronary artery disease, and then the infarction. Brain, it can cause a stroke because you're just not getting enough blood flow to the brain. Also, your extremities can be claudication, which is a lot of pain, and then gangrene, which is a cutoff of your blood flow to different parts of different limbs, which can cause necrosis, and your tissues can die. And then kidney damage, and then GI ischemia. So it's really bad. So basically, your heart affects everything. Anything that any organ in your body, well, every organ in your body has blood flow, and it needs blood flow. So if you have atherosclerosis, you're not going to get that blood flow, and then you're going to die. But how do we control it? So we have, well, different ways to control. We can control the blood sugar, we can control the blood pressure, and the lipids. But mainly we'll talk about the lipids. So I'm not sure why I put that line in there. But the main way to control these coronary artery blockages is by controlling the lipids. We can take nitrates, we can take beta blockers, we can take ACE inhibitors. That'll relieve some symptoms. But if you actually want to prevent the issue, you have to attack the conversion of the lipids and also the synthesis of the lipids. So let's go over the different types of lipids in the blood. So there's chylomicrons. They're more of like an accessory transporter lipid. If you can inhibit the synthesis of them, it will help, but not as much as inhibiting the synthesis or the reception by the LDL receptor of LDLs. So LDLs, bad cholesterol, they're the main production or the main producer of these plaques, of the plaque buildup. Then you have VLDLs, right? Very bad LDLs, so they're very LDL. So the LDL stands for low density lipoprotein. So if you have, and a VLDL is very low density lipoprotein. So the lower the density of the lipoprotein, the worse it is. The more they can create clots, because they can stick better to each other. So then you have IDLs, and guess what the I stands for? Yeah, intermediate. So you have low density, intermediate density. So it's made from LDLs and can produce LDLs. They're not good, but I mean they're LDLs with a little bit of higher density. lipid density. Then you have HDLs, which are good cholesterol. So they actually can bind to LDLs and transport them to the liver for excretion. So they have a mechanism to eliminate LDLs from the bloodstream. So HDLs are very good. And the more HDLs you have, the lower the risk of heart disease. Let's see, anything else I forgot on the chart? So here's the pathway of synthesis of your different lipids. You have IDLs, they can create LDL, which can then go to your receptors on your liver, which we want. Then you have VLDLs. We don't want VLDLs in the bloodstream. They can get there. So I mean, they're all made from different fatty acids. So if your diet has more fats, you're going to create more of these lipids, which in general is bad. And so you can create LDLs and HDLs at the same time, but I would rather have no LDLs or HDLs, well, not no, but like a healthy level of HDLs and LDLs compared to high of both. So it's good to have a low cholesterol diet. So statins. Is there a video on statins? So we're just going to go to a video on statins. So statins, like I said, they reduce or they inhibit the HMG coenzyme A reductase enzyme, which leads to the production of LDL. So we're inhibiting the enzyme that leads to that production. So we're going to watch a quick video on statins.
Professor.
Oh, someone said something? Yes.
For those who are genetically predisposed to having higher cholesterol, what part of the pathway is different for them?
So most likely it's a mutation in that HMG enzyme or another enzyme like it. So there's many enzymes that are involved in the process of synthesis of cholesterol synthesis. And if they're mutated, you're going to have more cholesterol synthesis. Or the LDL receptor. So that's a good point. I want to show you the LDL receptor real quick. So the LDL receptor, basically it binds LDL and brings it in for recycling. So LDL receptor is good. Now, what we want is, someone who's predisposed, someone who's predisposed to have high cholesterol, they may not have enough expression of LDL receptors. Or they might have an overexpression of PCSK9. So those are main avenues for naturally higher LDLs.
Okay, thank you.
No problem. So you're decreasing the rate limiting step. Now, a rate limiting step in any reaction is the most important. And if you inhibit, so the coenzyme that's responsible for that conversion, you're inhibiting cholesterol synthesis. Okay, well, that's basically, that's all that's important. Okay, so yeah, we're decreasing the synthesis, and also that decreasing that cholesterol synthesis has two effects. It increases the amount, It increases the amount of, or the expression level of the LDL receptor. Because the LDL receptor wants to bind LDL, right, to go through its metabolic function. So if not enough LDL is present in the bloodstream, the receptors are going to be hyperexpressed. This is really good because on the few LDLs that are out there, you'll now have more receptors that are receptive to binding it, internalizing it, and degrading it. So it's like a double whammy. Statins are great. Okay. So then we also have cholesterol absorption inhibitors. So this drug selectively inhibits absorption of dietary and biliary cholesterol in the small intestine, and it does not. So it's more in the stomach. So before your metabolism and distribution, or distribution metabolism, so part of your absorption process is in the stomach. The cholesterol has to go to the liver. Your cholesterol that you take in, that you eat. So this is more of a dietary type of drug. So to limit the absorption of this cholesterol, not really the best drug if you have a genetic predisposition. Probably not good at all, but it wouldn't do much if you already have a low cholesterol diet. So the toughest drug to make now, one of the hot topics in drug discovery are PCSK9 inhibitors. Now, what is PCSK9? So PCSK9 is a protein that binds to the LDL receptor. And what it does is it binds to it and it causes the internalization by the beta-arrestin pathway, which then leads to the lysosomal degradation of the LDL receptor. So think about what it's doing in the scheme of cholesterol. You have cholesterol in the bloodstream that is being taken up and killed or internalized and recycled by the LDL receptor. Then you have the negative feedback loop for having too many LDL receptors or having LDL receptors in general. You have PCSK9 will bind to it, internalize the receptor, degrade it, and then that will lead to more free LDL cholesterol in the bloodstream. So the idea is, how do we decrease the amount of this PCSK9? Well, in a mouse, we could do a knockdown, sure. But the best way is to drug it. If we drug PCSK9, then we end up with, or we successfully drug it, then it's inhibited and it can't bind to LDL. So far, only monoclonal antibody drugs have been developed for PCSK9. I was on a project that in grad school where we were working with small peptides to try to inhibit PCSK9. And we have weak affinities, but I mean, getting somewhere. But the monoclonal antibody treatments, like we know from the different types of drug delivery systems and different types of drugs, antibodies are the hardest to make, to store. They're the most expensive, and they're not very stable. So it's important for us to and they're very powerful drugs too, and they're very specific, not many side effects. So, and also, well, the biggest drawdown is from a patient perspective is that yes, they cost a lot, but also they require frequent injection. You can't take a pill that is an antibody because it will get broken down immediately by the stomach and through the absorption process and metabolized by the liver as well. So this is one of the big problems in healthcare right now, dealing with any kind of heart disease and things and cholesterol problems, is PCSK9 inhibitors. How do we get a small molecule or peptide inhibitor? So you have two ideas now for how to save the world and make a lot of money, right? So PCSK9 inhibitor, it's a small molecule, and an alternative for digoxin that does not cause crazy side effects and is specific to those receptors. Okay, so then is PCSK9. Kind of talked about it already. So here's the pathway again. So you have the LDL receptor, PCSK9 binds, internalizes it, breaks it down. The antibody will bind to the PCSK9 with high affinity before it goes to bind to the LDLR. Then in green right here, the LDL will bind to the LDL receptor. Then the LDL will be internalized and broken down, and the receptor will be regenerated. So this is what we want on the right. On the left, we have off in the bloodstream to reach the heart and cause a coronary block. It's a very powerful class of drugs. Any questions on that? Okay. So here's the antibody types. And you see they end with AB, meaning monoclonal antibody drug. And they're made for subcutaneous injections. Okay, so another alternative, instead of just a normal small molecule or maybe a peptide drug, is using RNA silencing. Did we talk about RNA silencing in this class? Or no? Forgot. Yeah, we did. Yeah, I think I mentioned it. Yeah. So, we did. That's okay. We did. So RNA silencing is another. We don't have to know this for the exam, but basically, it is a way to silence a gene from being transcribed or translated from the mRNA to the protein, and by way of introducing small interfering RNA, so siRNA. And a perfect name, small. So it's a small sequence that only aligns perfectly complementary to the mRNA sequence of that protein, in this case, PCSK9. So we get a sequence of RNA, you take the RNA, and then it will bind to the singular strand mRNA that is going to go to the ribosome to be translated. So instead of going to the ribosome, this RNA binds, which then causes, or the siRNA binds to it, complementary, and then it leads to the recruitment of the RISC complex. Now, the RISC complex is this protein complex that is responsible for degrading RNA. So the idea is it's the siRNA is like a target seeker, right? Like a heat-seeking missile. So it binds to the RNA of interest that you want to inhibit. Then here comes the warhead of the missile, which is the protein complex. Once the protein complex is coordinated by the siRNA, it will bind, cleave the hell out of that RNA. No more RNA, no more PCSK9. So that's one way to inhibit it, but I don't think we've not made those drugs yet. So there aren't many drugs on the market in general that are involved that have a RNA interference mechanism yet. So that's something that is another frontier of medicine that needs to be explored further. So antiarrhythmics, antiarrhythmics, yeah. But anyway, so that's how you say the word. I was about to say arithmetics, but it's not like aromatics, like chemistry. I was talking to someone about aromatics today. Yeah, antiarrhythmics. So arrhythmics. Yeah. So this class of drug, like I mentioned before, involves activation or mostly inhibition of, well, it could be either or, but I would say mostly activation of the sodium and potassium channels that are responsible for the polarization of the heart contractions. And this is really the only effective way to change the heart rate and the heart rhythm, is by affecting the ion channels. And there are many drugs that do that, but I mean, just know this as a way of doing it. So, yeah. Any questions on that? Pacemaker. Yes. So I mentioned that that's the best treatment for an arrhythmia, because these drugs have a lot of non-specific effects and side effects. So I mean, when I was little, I had a heart murmur, which is kind of like an arrhythmia, but a lot of children, small children, have a heart murmur when they grow up, but then it goes away. So I don't think I have one anymore. Hope not. But I think it's genetic. I think my mom had one too, until I think she still might. But it's things like that could be genetic, and the reason why is maybe there's an ionic gradient in my cardiac muscle that's a little bit off due to some genetic predisposition. So yeah, I feel pretty good. I went for a good run yesterday. My heart feels pretty good, so that's good. All right. So if there aren't any questions, these are the homework questions. We only have 4. So the main idea for next week is to prepare for your presentations. So that's the most important thing. And then, because I know all you guys would do fantastic on them. And any other questions? You mean like the beats themselves, like the arrhythmias? So it can be, usually it's not constant. So usually it's maybe like once an hour, once every 5 hours is an off beat. So think about it as, yes. Can you answer that? Can you answer that better from experience? Sure. Go for it. Right. So the idea is you want the coordination of rhythms, boom, boom, right? It's ventricle atrium. So you're contracting multiple cavities synchronously. So if you can imagine, if the ionic gradients aren't perfect and the contraction isn't perfect, maybe for 10 hours it would be normal and doable, but then once the gradient gets a little bit off too much, there's a weird pulse. There's a weird arrhythmia, but then it goes back to normal. So kind of like how a broken clock is right twice a day kind of thing, but the opposite. Right. Yeah. That good. I mean, she's an EMT, yes. So she's experienced a lot of this stuff. So that's awesome. Man, I wish I would have been an EMT when I was younger. That would bring a lot of this stuff full circle. That's a lot of training. My best friend was actually an EMT. A lot of training. Yeah. Anyway, good stuff. Okay. Any other questions?